Hello, everyone. Today I'll be examining how pharmaceutical advertising shapes public understanding of mental illness by comparing advertisements for Concerta, which is marketed for ADHD, and Vraylar, which is marketed for bipolar 1 disorder. Rather than evaluating whether these medications are good or bad treatments, my goal is to critically examine the narratives these advertisements create. Specifically, I'll explore how they communicate ideas about diagnosis, recovery, identity, and functioning, and why this matters for us as future therapists. Direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertisements are often one of the first ways people learn about psychiatric disorders. For many individuals, these advertisements shape expectations about what mental illness looks like, what recovery should feel like, and whether medication is viewed as the primary solution. As counselors, it's important to recognize that clients don't enter therapy as blank slates. They often arrive with beliefs and expectations that have already been influenced by the media, culture, and pharmaceutical marketing. My central argument is that pharmaceutical advertisements often rely on simplified symptom narratives that emphasize experiences such as emotional dysregulation, distractibility, and impaired functioning. Although Concerta and Vraylar are intended to treat different diagnoses, both advertisements construct remarkably similar stories about returning to one's real or normal self through medication. This becomes especially important because ADHD and bipolar disorder share several overlapping symptoms, including impulsivity, emotional regulation difficulties, and problems with attention and executive functioning. Without acknowledging this diagnostic complexity, advertisements can unintentionally encourage viewers to associate very common emotional experiences with a specific diagnosis and medication. This issue is particularly relevant for women who are more likely to experience delayed diagnosis or misdiagnosis because their symptoms often present differently than the stereotypical diagnostic profile. What interested me the most was that these advertisements are doing much more than selling a medication, they're selling a story. They create a narrative about what mental illness looks like, who is likely to experience it, and what recovery should involve. These stories can be incredibly powerful because they shape how people interpret their own experiences before they've ever spoken with a healthcare provider or therapist. As counselors, this matters because clients may come into therapy already believing they know what diagnosis they have or expecting medication to produce the type of transformation portrayed in these advertisements. Understanding those expectations allows us to approach treatment with a curiosity rather than assumption. So, looking at the ads, the Concerta advertisement from their website emphasizes improvements in attention, organization, productivity, impulse control, and success at work, school, and home. Meanwhile, the Vraylar advertisements focus on emotional stability, reducing mood extremes, improving relationships, and returning to everyday life. Both advertisements accurately describe approved treatment goals. However, what stood out to me the most was that they both frame medication as the primary pathway toward improved functioning and emotional well-being. Although the required safety information is technically included, it tends to appear quickly or in fine print, while the visual narrative remains overwhelmingly positive. More importantly, neither advertisement acknowledge how difficult differential diagnosis can be, particularly because many symptoms overlap across disorders. Instead, they present broad, relatable symptoms as though they clearly indicate a single psychiatric condition. This isn't necessarily because the information is false, rather, advertisements have a marketing objective. Their goal is to make psychiatric conditions feel recognizable and treatment feel accessible. To accomplish that, they simplify complex clinical concepts into brief emotional narratives that viewers can immediately identify with. From a clinical perspective, however, diagnosis is rarely this straightforward. Mental health assessment involves much more than recognizing a list of symptoms. Clinicians consider developmental history, symptom duration, severity, environmental influences, medical factors, trauma history, and patterns over time before arriving at a single diagnosis or concurrent diagnoses. Because of this, these advertisements risk creating the impression that recognizing familiar symptoms is enough to identify a disorder, when in reality, comprehensive assessment is essential. The emotional messaging was one of the strongest similarities I noticed when watching these advertisements. The Vraylar commercials both use before and after storytelling. Viewers watch women move from emotional distress into stability while reconnecting with partners, family, and meaningful life events. Warm lighting, hopeful music, and smiling families reinforce the message that medication restores not only emotional health, but also identity and relationships. The concerted advertising takes a different emotional approach, but reaches a similar conclusion. Rather than emphasizing emotional recovery, it focuses on productivity, organization, competence, and accomplishment. Medication is portrayed as the pathway towards becoming more capable and successful in daily life. In both advertisements, medication becomes symbolic. It's presented not simply as symptom management, but as the key to becoming the person you are meant to be. One thing I found particularly interesting is that neither advertisement simply promises symptom reduction, they promise restoration of identity. For Vraylar, recovery is portrayed through emotionally meaningful relationships. The women reconnect with loved ones, smile more, participate in family activities and weddings, and appear emotionally present. The message isn't just that symptoms improve, it's that medication allows them to become themselves again. Similarly, Consider doesn't simply promise improved attention. Instead, it associates medication with competence, organization, productivity, and success. Recovery becomes linked with meeting societal expectations of being an efficient employee, student, or parent. These narratives also communicate implicit assumptions about mental health. They suggest that recovery is linear, that symptoms have a clear biomedical solution, and that returning to normal functioning primarily depends on finding the right medication. While these stories are emotionally compelling, they don't reflect the reality that recovery is often nonlinear. People frequently experience setbacks, require adjustments in treatment, or benefit from combining medication with psychotherapy, lifestyle changes, and social support. As therapists, it's important to recognize how these emotional narratives may shape the expectations clients bring into treatment before they ever even meet us. Some clients may expect medication to quickly restore relationships or eliminate distress because that's the story they've seen repeatedly represented. When we compare ADHD and bipolar disorder clinically, we begin to see the limitations of these narratives. Both conditions involve difficulties with emotional regulation, impulsivity, concentration, and executive functioning. Research has found substantial rates of comorbidity between ADHD and bipolar disorder, meaning individuals may meet criteria for both conditions. Because of this overlap, comprehensive assessment is essential. Another important consideration is that many psychiatric assumptions are transdiagnostic, meaning they occur across multiple disorders rather than belonging to one diagnosis alone. Difficulties with attention, emotional regulation, sleep, impulsivity, and executive functioning can be present in ADHD, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, depression, trauma-related disorders, and even prolonged periods of chronic stress. This is why clinicians rarely diagnose based on individual symptoms alone. Instead, they examine how symptoms develop, when they first appeared, whether they're episodic or persistent, how they affect functioning, and what contextual factors may be contributing. However, these advertisements largely ignore diagnostic uncertainty. They encourage viewers to recognize familiar symptoms in themselves while implying those symptoms correspond neatly with one diagnosis and one medication. For counselors, this highlights the importance of careful assessment and psychoeducation. Clients may enter therapy believing they already know what fits because an advertisement reflected their own experience. Part of our role is helping clients understand that symptoms rarely exist in isolation, and that accurate diagnosis requires considering developmental history, trauma, relationships, culture, environmental stressors, and patterns over time. Rather than reinforcing simplified narratives, therapists can help clients hold a more nuanced understanding of their experiences, one that acknowledges both biological factors and the broader psychological, relational, and social contexts that contribute to mental health. So what didn't they say in these ads? Perhaps the biggest omission in both advertisements is complexity. Neither ad meaningfully discusses psychotherapy, collaborative care, lifestyle changes, or the reality that recovery is often nonlinear. Instead, it's presented as a primary solution with little acknowledgement that many people benefit from combining medication with therapy, behavioral interventions, social support, and environmental changes. Another omission that stood out is the absence of context. Neither advertisement asks why someone might be experiencing difficulty concentrating, emotional dysregulation, or changes in mood. Experiences such as adverse childhood experiences, grief, financial stress, relationship conflict, discrimination, caregiving responsibilities, or chronic stress are almost entirely absent from the narrative. Instead, distress is framed primarily as an individual biomedical problem with an individual biomedical solution. While it's important to note that medication can absolutely be an important and life-changing component of treatment, as therapists, we recognize that symptoms often develop within interpersonal, developmental, and socio-cultural contexts. Recovery frequently involves understanding these contexts in addition to reducing symptoms. These omissions matter because clients may begin treatment expecting medication alone to restore functioning, and if those expectations are not met immediately, some clients may feel discouraged or believe that treatment has failed, when in reality, recovery is often gradual and multidimensional. So looking at psychological and relational impact, both the Concerta and Vraylar advertisements encourage viewers to recognize themselves in broad, highly relatable experiences. And because these symptoms are common across many psychiatric conditions, people will see themselves reflected deeply in these narratives. While this can certainly have positive effects for some individuals, seeing their experiences represented may reduce shame, validate confusing symptoms, normalize seeking treatment, and encourage them to reach out for professional support. There's also a potential downside to self-identification. These advertisements may encourage viewers to identify with a specific diagnosis before receiving comprehensive clinical assessment, instead of viewing symptoms as one piece of a much larger clinical picture. From a therapeutic perspective, these expectations matter. Our role isn't to dismiss those beliefs, but to explore them with curiosity. Through psychoeducation and collaborative assessment, we can help clients understand that symptoms are only one part of understanding mental health, and that healing often involves biological, psychological, relational, and environmental factors working together. So why is this especially relevant for women? The psychological impact becomes especially important when we consider the gender bias. Historically, ADHD has been conceptualized and researched primarily through presentations observed in young boys. As a result, many girls and women whose symptoms look different were overlooked or diagnosed much later in life. ADHD in women is frequently under-recognized because it often presents differently than the stereotypical image people may associate with the disorder. Rather than external hyperactivity, women are more likely to experience internalized symptoms such as emotional dysregulation, anxiety, depression, chronic overwhelm, executive function difficulties, and masking behaviors. Many women also develop coping strategies that allow them to compensate academically or socially for years on end, making their struggles less visible to others. As a result, they may not seek treatment until anxiety, depression, burnout, or emotional exhaustion become too overwhelming. These presentations overlap considerably with mood disorders, particularly bipolar disorder, increasing the likelihood of delayed diagnosis or even misdiagnosis. Research also reflects this pattern in treatment. Approximately 14% of girls receive antidepressants before ADHD medication, compared with only 5% of boys, suggesting that emotional symptoms are often recognized and treated before ADHD is ever considered. When advertisements present broad emotional experiences through a single diagnostic lens, they may also unintentionally reinforce these existing diagnostic biases. Rather than encouraging viewers to explore the complexity of their experiences, they can create the impression that familiar symptoms point towards one clear diagnosis and corresponding medication. This highlights the importance of comprehensive assessment as counselors and the importance of considering all the different complexities of an experience rather than simplified narratives. So, looking at ethical considerations and why this all matters so much to therapists. Psychologically, these advertisements may shape how clients understand themselves and their distress. While they may feel hopeful and validated, this can reduce stigma and encourage treatment seeking. In that sense, pharmaceutical advertisement can serve as an important public health function by increasing awareness that effective treatments exist. At the same time, clients may begin viewing themselves primarily through a diagnostic label or believe medication alone should resolve their struggles. When recovery doesn't unfold the way advertisements portray it, they may question themselves or feel discouraged. As therapists, our responsibility isn't to oppose medication or tell clients that advertisements are misleading. Instead, our ethical responsibility is to help clients think critically about the messages they receive regarding mental health. This might involve asking questions like, what about this advertisement feels familiar to you? What made you feel like it reflected your own experience? What are you hoping treatment will look like? And these kind of conversations create space for curiosity rather than persuasion. We can also validate the biological aspects of mental illness while also acknowledging the importance of trauma, relationships, culture, environmental stressors, and personal meaning. This balanced approach supports informed decision-making, respects client autonomy, and helps clients understand medication as one valuable component of treatment rather than the entire treatment. So in conclusion, although Concerta and Vraylar target different psychiatric disorders, both rely on remarkably similar narratives of impaired functioning, emotional relief, and restored identity. By framing broad psychological experiences through a single diagnostic lens, these advertisements oversimplify the overlap between ADHD and bipolar disorder, particularly for women, whose presentations are more likely to be overlooked or misinterpreted. Ultimately, these advertisements are persuasive because they don't simply market medication. They tell emotionally compelling stories about identity, recovery, and hope. Those stories can reduce stigma and encourage people to seek help, which is an important benefit, and at the same time, they often minimize the complexity of diagnosis, differential assessment, and the multidimensional nature of recovery. As counselors, our role is not to oppose medication, but to help clients thoughtfully understand the messages they receive about mental health. Through comprehensive assessment, psychoeducation, and collaborative therapeutic exploration, we can help clients distinguish between marketing narratives and clinical realities while supporting informed treatment decisions. Ultimately, healing is rarely defined by medication alone. It's shaped by biology, relationships, lived experience, environmental context, culture, and the therapeutic relationship itself. By helping clients integrate all these factors, we support a more nuanced and empowering understanding of mental health, one that extends beyond simplified advertising narratives. Thank you.